So a lot of discussion, right? So more one-on-one interactions. As we get started here, I'm gonna kind of go around and introduce our staff here. So right here, well, actually, I'll start here. This is Nick Harrington, our communications manager for the state of South Dakota Game Fish Parks. Here we've got Chris Cudmore. He's one of our habitat and access biologists. Grant Truskowski, our other habitat and access biologist. Jake Davis, our program manager. Program administrator. He oversees habitat and access, invasive species, non-game, and research and surveys. That's Blaise Bursell. He's one of our resource biologists here. He does most of his work in the Black Hills reservoirs. Back there, our newest employee, Chuck Mordhorst. He just started back in July. So he's kind of all over, but has a lot of knowledge of stream fisheries here in the Black Hills. And then our staff member emeritus, Craig Simpson, he retired, and Chuck took his job. And then we've got Gene Gallinat. Gene's been here for a number of years. Most of you probably know Gene. He does, stuff all over the Black Hills and the West River fisheries. And then Bill Miller, our other resource biologist, and he focuses mostly on the prairie waters. So that's I forgot the most important one. John Lott, our fisheries chief, came out from Pierce, so it's good to have all those guys here. So kind of the agenda for tonight, obviously just went through the staff introductions, but kind of want to, go back to the basics a little bit and kind of talk about trout management and, kind of how we view what we do when it comes to trout in the Black Hills. We'll kind of transition from that into some stream updates, some of the things that we're seeing in the stream, some of the things that we're doing. Give a little update on our reservoirs. Then our habitat and access guys are going to talk about some of the things that they're doing to improve trout habitat throughout the Black Hills. After that, we'll open it up, have a Q&A time. You guys can throw questions at us and we'll answer them. And then if you aren't comfortable asking your question in the big format, we'll be here at tables around the room. And so if you just want to come and talk to us one-on-one, we'll be here for that. So we'll kind of roll right into it here. So kind of looking at, our Black Hills trout management and sort of how we view things, how we do what we do. So when we look at our Black Hills streams, we do very minimal stocking, and most of our fisheries are driven by what we call natural yield or, wild reproduction, brown trout mostly, in our headwater streams, we have trout. And then, because, a lot of these streams are wild reproduction, there is a regulation on there. So there's a 1/14 regulation that applies to streams only. When we look at our reservoirs in the Black Hills, kind of look at that through a little bit different lens of how we manage. So most of our Black Hills reservoirs receive fairly frequent stockings, either annual or every other year type stockings, fairly heavy stocking rates. We're basically managing catchable trout stockings to provide high catch rates to the angler. Most of that is rainbow trout. That's the most readily available product in our hatcheries. Those fish grow a lot better in our hatcheries than, some of the other species. And so that's the one that just makes more sense. That doesn't mean that we don't have other species, but it's sort of on a, as available basis. So like I said, we do have some of these other species, cutthroat trout, tiger trout. Those species, we get them in, once every 2-3 years type of a thing, or when they're available. Usually we're getting those fish from other partner states to the west. So it's just kind of what's available to us. Then, we've got lake trout in Pactola and Deerfield. Pactola, that we haven't stocked lake trout in Pactola for probably 20 years. Most of that is driven by natural reproduction. Deerfield, on the other hand, that is primarily driven by stocking at this point. We've done, I think, 3 or 4 different years of stockings, and all those fish were made available to us from the Saratoga hatchery in Wyoming. It's a federal fish hatchery system. Those fish were retired broodstock fish, so they're fairly large, went in, kind of created an immediate fishery. My understanding from the federal hatchery guys is that we are no longer raising a broodstock there. And so the availability of those fish to us is not available at this point until, a later date that maybe they restart. We have not seen any reproduction of lake trout in Deerfield to this point. And so that's just kind of a wait and see thing. But at this point, it doesn't look like there's been reproduction. So, all right. So kind of talk about Blackfield's streams for a few minutes here. And the next few slides after this, I'm going to be kind of throwing some numbers up there. So I wanted to throw this slide out there to help you understand kind of how we classify our trout streams. So for brown trout and brook trout, you guys can kind of think about this as kind of like blue ribbon, if you will. So our best brown trout streams can be classified as brown trout 1. Our best brook trout streams are brook trout 1. 2 would be lesser numbers per acre. Brown trout 3, lower numbers per acre, that sort of a thing. Rainbow trout, because we have very minimal natural reproduction of rainbow trout and very few stream rainbow trout populations, we have those at a different rate, different classification system. So only 25 fish per acre would make that a rainbow trout 1 versus 150 for brown trout and brook trout. So a little bit different classification based on those different species. So talking about Rapid Creek for a few minutes, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about Rapid Creek in town, and then transition to the basin below Pactola area. So what I've got up here for you is kind of some long-term averages. Those first numbers, 2010 to 2022, you can see that's kind of our long-term average for our sites in town. So, the juvenile numbers we're not as concerned about. We're mostly looking at that adult number. So 71 adult brown trout. If we, start looking at 2024 and 2025, you can see those numbers are a little off of our historical averages. So when we look at that and we see 22, we're looking at about 30% of our historical averages. So kind of, some of you may remember a few years back, we had an incident with the management of Pactola. They dropped the flows down to do some maintenance. That happened in December. It was very cold. We had about 1 CFS of flow coming through Dark Canyon. So our numbers have been down since then. So we're kind of looking at, okay, a little bit of concerning numbers there. What can we do to improve that? We'll talk about what we're doing to address that here in a few minutes.
What's an adult per size?
So those juvenile and adult numbers. So adult brown trout would be anything over 8 inches. under 8 inches, we consider that a juvenile. Thank you. So, here's, Pactola Basin. Pactola Basin's, the 2 mile stretch right below, the dam. Special regulation area, catch and release only, artificial, lives and lures only. So historically, this has kind of been our crown jewel, if you will, one of our best fisheries for trout. So you look at those numbers, a little bit different numbers, from the historical average, 21 adult brown trout on a historical average, but much larger size structure. Again, looking at our 2024 data, our 2025 data, we're down, 20-30% of our historical averages. So we're seeing, impacts up in the basin, seeing those impacts in town, similar trends, in both places. So kind of contrast, those concerns with low abundance on, Rapid Creek to maybe a concern of overabundance on Spearfish Creek. So some of you may remember, back in 2017, 2018, 2019, there was a master's student doing work on Spearfish Creek, and his master's thesis was focused on experimental density reductions. So basically, we were going in, removing a portion of the population and looking at the growth response of those trout. So just to give you a little bit of context, so this is, data from a site in Spearfish Creek that we sampled just this past summer. 232 brown trout per, that's adult brown trout, per 100 meters. When you calculate that out to fish per mile, that's about 8,000 per mile. Generally, if you had 2,000 brown trout per mile, that would be considered high abundance. So because of that extremely high density, we see slow growth, compared to our other streams. And so that's what you see in this graph right here is, that spearfish biomass, of all those fish collectively in comparison to Rapid Creek and Castle Creek.
What would the breakdown be there between adult and non-adult in that 232?
So that 232 is adult brown trout.
Adult.
Yep. So, that just kind of, puts the lens on, these two different streams and the differences in our populations. And so one of the things that we've looked at is, well, maybe there's an opportunity here, maybe, we can manage these in tandem, taking from our overabundance and moving down to our lower abundance. So, I believe in 2023, so in envisioning that, maybe we'd start taking some fish out of Spearfish Creek, we put together a plan to do some fish health sampling on Spearfish Creek. So if this is going to be a source population that we're going to take from and move fish into another location, we want to make sure we're not moving around any pathogens, diseases. So we went out and we consulted with our hatcheries, went through their protocol as far as, what they would do for fish health, got a clean bill of health back. And so when we got that clean bill of health, that kind of set into motion, okay, maybe we can start moving some of these fish into Rapid Creek. So these are some stocking numbers. So 144 adult brown trout we have moved from Spearfish into the Pactola Basin area. We've also moved 576 adult brown trout from Spearfish Creek into the in-town reach of Rapid Creek. Each of those two areas also got 5,000 from our state hatcheries within the last couple of years. So that's kind of what we've done to date. Because we haven't seen Rapid Creek respond to the level that we'd like to see it at, we're still seeing, fairly low numbers in some of these sites. We're going to keep working on this. So our plan for 2026 is sort of to start doing some evaluation behind this plan. And so one of the things that, we hear about, if you're out fishing on Spearfish Creek and you see game fishing parks pull up and we start electrofishing and pulling all these fish out, it probably looks a little concerning. And so, we want to be cognizant of, the look of that. We feel like there's pretty good, data to support why we need to do some reductions and why we have overabundance. But we also want to evaluate the impact on the actual areas that we're removing fish, especially if we're taking fish from areas that are, high congregation areas for anglers. So, one of the things, it's access based. And so, if there's a pull off in Spearfish Canyon, that's the easiest spot to take fish from. But that's also where anglers are fishing. And so our evaluation is kind of two-part. It's to look at, what's happening in the near, mid, and long term on Spearfish Creek. Are, fish moving in after we remove fish? Is that density, getting filled back in? How long does it take for that to fill back in? That's kind of our idea there. And then we'll be pit tagging some of these fish so that we can track their, are they staying in the locations that we stocked them at? Are they moving up to different locations? And then those pit tags have an individual identifier so we can track individual fish growth over time and see if there's a growth response being removed from that high density, density dependent system into a system with more resources to spread around the fish. So that's kind of looking at our streams, kind of our stream plan for the next couple of years here. Kind of moving on to just a quick overview of, our large reservoirs. Our large reservoirs, this is kind of what I talked about in our sort of our philosophy of how we manage these systems. Pactola, Rainbow, Deerfield, primarily we're managing those as high catch rate rainbow trout fisheries. Obviously, those lake trout provide a very popular additional fishing opportunity. It's a unique opportunity to the Black Hills that they don't have anywhere else in the state. And so definitely, we look at that population. The Pactola population, we do pay a little more attention to that than we do up at Deerfield, just because we haven't seen that natural reproduction up at Deerfield. And so on Pactola, we're seeing good size structure. We're seeing lake trout of multiple age classes. We're seeing young lake trout all the way up to, big lake trout like this one in the picture. So from what we're seeing, that lake trout population is very healthy. Pactola does have some brown trout. We've stocked those in the past. Again, those browns are available to us at times. Sometimes they're not. And so that stocking is kind of infrequent. But we do see those fish, and most recently we've been starting to see some fairly large brown trout coming out of here, or Pactola. So that's been good to see. So that's kind of an overview of, how we're managing those large reservoirs. Then in Custer State Park, we've got, these 4 reservoirs in Custer State Park. And the one thing that we've kind of done down there is sort of the special opportunity, if you will, for other species. So we're stocking tiger trout and cutthroat trout when available through our hatchery system into Center Lake and Sylvan Lake. Just to provide another species out there, something different and unique for people to chase in our state park. Legion and Bismarck, like our other reservoirs, we're managing as high catch rates with rainbow trout, and Sylvan and Center. Obviously, all 4 of these get a lot of use through the summer and the tourism aspect. So we keep those pretty heavily stocked. So kind of looking at, what are we concerned about? What are we thinking about? Talked about our recovery from that Rapid Creek low water event. We're, put some things in place, put a plan in place to try to address that low abundance in Rapid Creek, and we'll continue those efforts into the near future and continue to evaluate that recovery effort. Invasive species, we get questions about it all the time. Obviously, if you're a boater, you probably have encountered our watercraft inspection stations at Pactola, Sheridan. So sort of the update there, we haven't seen any fish impacts, but zebra mussels are, part of the landscape now. And our thing is educate the public, clean, drain, dry. Clean your boat, drain it, make sure it's dry. Try to slow that spread from one water body to the next. On our infested water bodies, Pactola, we're doing exit inspections, whereas our other water bodies would be an entrance inspection. So this past fall, we did find zebra mussels in Sheridan Lake. So that will also now be shifting to exit inspections, rather than an entrance inspection when you get to the lake. So no doubt it's drought conditions out there. So certainly something that we're paying attention to. I certainly envision that flows out of Pactola this coming summer are going to be lower than average. That's probably going to lead to, higher stream temperatures through town and Rapid City. So there's obviously some impacts from the drought conditions. I wish I could make it rain, but I can't. So hoping for better conditions on that end of things. And then, in the Black Hills and all throughout the Black Hills, we have a number of streams that are incised. The riparian areas aren't functioning as they used to. And so just the idea of degraded streams and the impacts of stream conditions on trout fishing. And so that kind of gives me an opportunity to bring our habitat guys up. So working on habitat conditions is kind of their forte. So I'm going to pass it off to Grant here.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I'm Grant Truskowski, half of the Aquatic Habitat and Access team in Rapid City, Chris Cudmore, my counterpart here. Yeah, I'm just going to go over and plug a few of the projects that we've got in the works for this upcoming year. Everything is going to be trout related, not specifically stream related, but things we've got going on habitat and access wise for trout specific waters. A couple things on Rapid Creek that I'm going to touch on are really big. collaborative project that we've been working on with Black Hills Fly Fishers over the last couple of years, and then some other new developments here in town. Going to touch on a little project going on up in Spearfish, working with the Parks and Rec department there. A little bit of a in-house sort of pilot project that we're doing on Spring Creek, and then a couple of ponds down in Custer that are getting quite a bit of work done. So in Pactola Basin, this is a pretty large, intense, collaborative project that we've been working with the fly fishers and local engineering company here in town, Respect. The genesis of this project was going back over some of the work that the department had done about 10 years ago within this reach, where we really weren't satisfied with the outcomes of that project. It was kind of a random boulder placement below the USGS weir in the Pactola Basin. And we really just didn't feel like we were getting a lot out of it that we had expected to see. So we sort of went back to the drawing board with this. We brought in Respect to do some really high-end modeling to show us, you know, if we place these boulders and these log jams in a specific configuration, you know, what can we expect to see out in the field versus the first rendition of this project, which was a consultant engineer on site sort of placing things based on their experience, which, again, we weren't super thrilled with that outcome. So this model gives us basically a pretty confident expectation of what we can see. And so going back through these reaches, we wanted to try and really focus on connectivity within the reach, you know, based on some of our data and some of our surveys in the past, you know, and even anglers can probably attest to this. And, you know, you get out there and a lot of these fish hold up in the same pockets. And in between, there's not really a lot of great habitat. There's not really great connectivity between where you can typically find these fish. And so we're trying to increase that footprint and provide an area that they can move between their already existing pockets of good habitat and have different areas to basically populate in this reach. And so using this model, we can find that the expectation is that we're going to create these sort of interstitial spaces between the existing habitat, and we're going to go from sort of a uniform glide type of stream reach where there's not really a lot going on in terms of complexity or habitat. You know, it's a little bit shallow, it's pretty wide, and it's almost like the water's just smooth as it flows through there. And so looking at the model and showing different velocities, showing different stream power, and just showing, you know, how we can create these different water features for these fish to inhabit. Black Hills Fly Fishers have been really a key component throughout the entire process, taking them out on walkthroughs, getting their input, big part of the user base, and then they've had this as a targeted project that they're raising funds for over the last 2 years. So really happy to be involved with them. So what's next with this? We have some pretty short-term accomplishables that we're really excited about. We recently walked the entire reach with the engineers from Respect. We did a little bit of last-second tinkering with the existing plan set. And so what we're looking at here is that entire reach, and a little bit of that, the two middle sections there are part of a new existing phase of this project. The original scope was the uppermost reach and the bottommost reach, but through some of the modeling insight, we figured out that we can have some additional impacts if we create a bigger footprint. So we started to look at some of the work between the two original reaches, and so we have 4 sort of impact areas now. But things left to do. We're going to get a final schematic here sometime in May. Just those additional considerations that we got on our last walkthrough, which was 2 weeks ago, are going to be put down into plans, and then they're going to go to stakeholders for review. We can have about a month or so to look through those and basically have some last minute edits, and then they're going to be sent off to the Forest Service and the Army Corps of Engineers for their approval. Once that is happening, it's going to go out for bid sometime in July, August, hopefully, depending on the specifics of what we include in the package, how we want it broken down in terms of, cost per line item or sort of just a lump sum thing. Still things to figure out on our end engineering wise, but it's probably going to go out for about a month. And then the construction goal is sometime this November, dependent on flows, dependent on weather. We'll try and time it after the brown trout spawn so that any of this in-stream work isn't going to be conflicting with reds or any of those nests that they've got out there. So a really achievable timeline that we're looking at here, which is pretty exciting. A lot of the modeling too, I should say, is considered of flows that we're expected to see at all different flow regimes throughout those releases. So everything from the lower end when they're pushing water out of the auxiliary pipe, which is like 18 CFS or somewhere in that neighborhood, up to 500 or so CFS, and another part of that model shows that the feature and the structures are going to be impactful at all those different flows. And if you go out now, there's some of that material that's in the bank that's sort of sitting high and dry when we're in this low flow levels. So it's 24 CFS right now. So yeah, the model's just allowing us to be really confident in what we hopefully will expect to see. I talked about some stuff in town, and some of this stuff is very new, recently developed. I threw in a little background information there on those first 2 points because I think they help sort of tell the story of some of the things that we have to make sure we're in the right and doing things correctly with some of the work we do. So there was a long-term thought out there that the folks in Rapid City, the emergency response teams, didn't want a lot of structure in the creek because it was a liability and a hazard to people. We've met with the rapid response team and the fire chief basically to get their approval on a bunch of different structures that they're okay with having in town that they signed off on, and we're looking forward to hopefully implementing. Another recent development is from the Army Corps of Engineers, where prior to last weekend, when they've updated their sort of 4-year addendum on how these nationwide permits are allocated and signed off on, they sort of have rewritten the process. So every 5 years, they go and look at, what people need to submit projects, and they adjust those a little bit. And so basically for the work that we're doing in streams, the application process and the approval from the Army Corps of Engineers has gotten a lot easier, where we don't have to do pre-construction notifications. We don't really have to meet with the Corps. We don't have to do some of these wetland delineations and these big plan sets beforehand, where we can essentially write them a report. And as long as what we're doing is going to have beneficial impacts, they sort of sign off on it. We keep them updated along the way, but it's really going to streamline a lot of projects and hopefully get work done on the ground quicker. And so with that knowledge and with the approval from the Rapid City Fire Department, there's some in-stream structure that we're hoping to implement rather soon in Rapid Creek below Sheridan Lake Road. So it's the bridge has a little bit of an impact where the creek's really over wide there, and hoping to add just some woody structure along the banks. And it's, again, just going to try and disrupt the flow a little bit in a way that we can create some scour pools during high flows and have a little bit of complexity there. And then in the long term, we've been talking with Rapid City Public Works and their floodplain management team, because they have a lot of work along Rapid Creek, essentially from Sheridan Lake Road. The current reach they're looking at runs all the way down to about Omaha, a little past there. And it's a good about mile stretch of creek where they have some floodplain work that they want to do because there's issues with some of their stormwater runoff that they're having in town. And so they reached out to us and wanted to incorporate some fish habitat components within their floodplain work, since they're already going to be in the creek, already going to be getting permits for these things. And so we've been meeting with them recently, just trying to develop a long-term vision of how we can basically marry some fish habitat components into some of the floodplain work that they're going to be doing. Moving up to Spearfish Creek, here's a little before and after of a native shoreline planting that we implemented last year. We were in sort of roundtable discussions with the city of Spearfish, who had came to us and wanted to know some best management practices for the Spearfish Creek corridor for the city property that they owned, where the creek runs through town. And right off the bat, one of the first things I noticed was that they have this turf grass that's, probably Bermuda or St. Augustine that they pretty religiously mow right up to the creek's edge, and they probably spend a lot of time and money doing that and maintaining it. And one of the first things I brought up that would have been easy to implement were these native shoreline plantings where you can have a little bit of bank integrity. You can see some bank erosion from high flows, and this will help combat that a little bit, but also just help keep a designated access area. A lot of these areas that the city owned are really loved to death by people. It's a lot of park property where they're getting in the creek, and if we can sort of concentrate access in specific areas, this is one way to help with that. But they wanted to do it in a way that wasn't just going to be looked at from citizens walking on the bike path as just overgrown, mismanaged weeds. And so we came up with an approach where we have some nice showy blooms with nice wildflowers that are blooming out throughout the different growing seasons. So some stuff in spring and summer, and then some stuff in fall, and then really just approach it with some native grasses and hope to get better shoreline integrity there. So this was one reach we did last year. We keep wanting to expand every year, and so the big picture, we see Spearfish Creek as it runs through part of town there, and the green is all the different city-owned properties. And then the two in-cuts are what we've looked at to continue working on this year. And I basically look at this as, Spearfish city is one big landowner. And, if you were going to sign up a landowner who had, what we're looking at right here is just a mile of creek. So if you had a landowner that had a half mile of creek on their property and they wanted to implement best management practices, that's a big, exciting thing. And so, you take these projects and you expand over time and you expand that footprint and hopefully get some big changes down the road. And we're going to continue working with the city on these best management practices and their creek preservation plans and help them continue to implement some stuff that's going to be, beneficial to anglers and beneficial to fish too. So if you've been around the hills in the last year or two, you've probably heard the term process-based restoration. And basically what that means is it's another way to look at in-stream habitat projects from the other end of the spectrum from what I just showed you with the Pacatola Basin project. So where that's very high intense modeling, very specific, very sort of manicured. This is really like a messy way to just get structure into the creek to help restore the stream's functionality. And so reconnect it with the floodplain, and just restore some of the issues that we're seeing. A lot of our hill streams are battling incision. They don't really retain water that well. And so an idea that we had is try and just do a little bit of an in-house evaluation of these techniques, as a lot of this process-based restoration is gaining momentum, and a lot of different agencies throughout the hills are doing their own sort of versions of this. You have the Forest Service, the Fly Fishers, Watershed Collaborative are all taking on sort of a life of their own with this process-based restoration. So we want to just, as we develop some of our own stuff, which we have down the road with Box Elder Creek and potentially part of a state wildlife grant fund that we're pursuing, we want to make sure that what we're doing is going to be efficient and having some impacts that we can really be confident that we're seeing. So what we're looking at here is a reach of game production property. So it's GFP owned property up in the hills, just north of Crazy Horse, right off 385. And we got about 1.25 miles of creek that runs through that game production area property. So our idea is to use some of the historical fisheries data that we've seen there, and then a little bit of our own anecdotal evidence and sort of compare some of these structures. So in process-based restoration, there's different sorts of features you can make, whether it's a post-assisted log structure or a PAL. And so there's different iterations there. Or there's beaver dam analogs is sort of the other one that's really taken a strong hold in the hills. And that's basically a human-made beavic mimicry device that's going to sort of slow the water, allow those sediments to filter out, allow the stream to reconnect to the floodplain. And so knowing that we can pursue some of these in-stream projects easier because of the Army Corps engineer allowing us to work in the creek a little easier, we thought that's a good opportunity to sort of implement some of these techniques on our own on our own creeks that we have a lot of historical data on before, moving on down the road onto bigger and better reaches. So those are the stream projects that we've had in the works. And then these are a few different trout related still water projects. This is the visitor center pond up in Custer State Park. So it's sort of part of that Grace Coolidge Creek system coming down from Center Lake. You get the walking area of the 6 or 7 ponds and then flows along the campgrounds here. So this is sort of that last impoundment right at the visitor center. We were actually approached by the parks team there, and they wanted to do some work on a new low-head dam there, and they wanted to cost share that. And so we sort of said, hey, let's pump the brakes on this and see if there's more that we can get out of this project while we're both interested in doing something on this water here. And so eventually we got to the point where we had set up a way that we were going to cost share for a contractor to come in, and he was going to do the low-head dam instead of them renting some equipment and doing it themselves. Then we came up with a sediment map based on some surveys we had done the year prior, where we go in and basically we poke holes in the ice and see how much sediment is built up. And from that, we can project how much material's there. So we combined a project that the park was going to do with this new low-head dam, and we're able to remove a bunch of sediment that was accumulating in the pond. And then we figured while we're at it, why don't we go ahead and install some shore fishing amenities. And so we included on the south shore these rock fishing pods, if you will, and they're about 4 foot by 8 foot. And really it's just to give the anglers another extra little bit of length there off the shore and provide a little bit of a better amenity. If kids going out there with grandpa and they don't really like standing on the riprap, and they can have nice, even low maintenance, especially for us as we get more of these amenities out there. It's very easy to get out and maintain. Just additional amenities to get users onto the landscape. And then the last one's a pretty big one, is Custer West Dam. If you've been in Custer and have driven west on Highway 16, you've probably seen a lot of earth being moved there. This is a project that the city of Custer has really taken the lead on, and we've been along for the ride and have provided expertise for both access amenities and then some in-reservoir habitat as well. This is basically a full-scale renovation of what was once Custer West Dam. It had breached back in 2011 or 2012 and had lost, the ability to essentially hold water. The city has raised a bunch of money, and they have found some donors to contribute to the cause as well, and they've set up some funds through Black Hills Area Community Foundation. And there's billboards out there. They've got a website, QR codes, a couple different press releases, and so this is like a full-scale renovation. They've excavated about 90,000 cubic yards of material over the last maybe 9 months or so. They're rebuilding the dam embankment and the spillway. We've added some in-reservoir fish habitat, like I mentioned. So we've had a good year for fish habitat in terms of natural structure because some of those big blowdown events, and we have a lot of woody material up in Custer right now. So we put out about 100 root wads, sort of congregate fish along that north shoreline where those 3 fishing platforms are, and then another about 50 or so boulder structures that are really just to break up sort of the uniformity of the bowl-shaped reservoir. And so this is currently in the works. They are wrapping up the sediment removal. Like I said, there's about 90,000 cubic yards of material there. And then once they're done with that, they're going to be rebuilding the outlet works and the dam embankment. And hopefully we'll be back online sometime this fall. Take a little bit of time to get the water to fill up the full pool. But, this is going to be your sort of quintessential community urban fishery. Probably going to be rainbow trout stocked at first, but potential for trap and transfer opportunity as that arises for panfish, bass, that sort of stuff. But really exciting to have this amenity back online, and some really great partners involved in that as well. And so that is all I've got for you for habitat and access. Feels like we're wrapping up here, so turn it back over to Jeremy.
All right, thanks, Grant. Well, so basically at this point, we'll kind of open it up for question and answer period. Just, doesn't necessarily have to be trout related, but this is a trout meeting. So, whatever questions you guys have, we're here to answer them. If you want to throw your questions out now, go for it. If you'd rather just talk to us off to the side, you can hold your questions and there'll be opportunities to chat at us off to the side after this.
It's kind of one of those off the wall question. What's the beavers in town? What is that doing to your planning things?
So for anybody online or out there who didn't hear the question is what are beavers in town doing with our plans? I'll answer, and then if Grant and Chris have something to add to it. There's quite a few beavers in town, and one of the things that, they're a nuisance to the city. The city has, these nice greenway areas and, they're chewing on the trees. One of the things that we've done on the fly fishers have taken a big effort in this is actually painting trees. And so it's basically a sand paint mixture painted onto the base of trees to deter beavers from chewing on those. The city has done some trapping. There's been some work trying to live trap beavers and move them into areas in the hills that could use some beavers. And so there's been some different things that way as far as the beavers in town, but I don't know if Grant or Chris has anything to add to that.
No, I think, the big one you covered is there's some people being proactive about painting those really, the big cottonwoods and big willows that provide some of that shade relief along the creek. And, I think focusing on those trees, you can be a little proactive and sort of stop a problem before it arises, because some of those big cottonwoods are probably like 100 years old. And it's one thing to have that shade, and, if you go out and plant a 6-foot sapling, you're going to have to wait a while until that can actually provide any shade relief.
They seem to take the nice ones, though.
Other questions?
In certain years, Spring Creek can be a great fishery, and over the years it goes dry.
Sure.
I wonder if any study has been made to see whether you could augment Spring Creek with groundwater. It is called Spring Creek.
Sure. I don't know of any specific studies as far as like groundwater interchange on Spring Creek. I'm guessing you're referring to below Sheridan.
Yeah, we're drilling some wells in the into the aquifer.
Right. Jake, maybe from a historical perspective, for those that don't know, Jake was in my role, about 4 years ago. But do you have any history on that at all?
I'm not aware of any studies for Spring Creek that have looked at using groundwater to supplement that surface flow. And certainly aware of the valve there on the dam and things that is operated from time to time with partnership with the Forest Service when they're comfortable operating that. We have had some discussions on drilling wells on some small impoundments in central and South Dakota, essentially to help augment surface flows. Where staff have run into issue is actually well drillers. And then also as far as a beneficial use of that well water. We have had conversations on doing that management technique, but not necessarily for Spring Creek, looking more at some small impoundments in central South Dakota. But there's certainly some hurdles that go along with it.
Well, as you know, it's a very attractive fishery when there's water.
When there's water.
So where are we at on that valve? I mean, who's managing it? I mean, I know we one year released a lot of water out of it, and next year didn't. And what is the management of that? I guess and who controls it?
Yeah, it's U.S. Forest Service that controls that valve.
Yeah.
And they kind of keep it right where it is unless there's a flood stage situation. and then they'll go and open it up, kind of crank it out. And there's a auxiliary valve or something like that. But yes, Forest Service that manages that.
Yeah, like when we need it, they won't be releasing it, like drought years, I suppose, because it comes out of Sheridan Lake.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't want to, it's taboo to ever lower the level that way.
Yeah, when we operated, Jeff, in the past, there was a certain cutoff level of elevation for Sheridan where we would, if they weren't comfortable dropping below due to recreation on it. So, yeah, it was certainly one that took a lot of conversations, and it was, definitely part of those, big hurdle.
Another thing to address your question is some of the work that Grant and Chris are planning on doing in Spring Creek. There are implications for lowering stream temperature. In other places in the West, a lot of this process-based restoration that they're doing is done with the intention of decreasing stream temperatures. And it does that by putting water back in the bank to, when the streams are incised, like they were addressing the issue, water tends to flash off the landscape rather than kind of fill that sponge in the bank and release more slowly over time. So there's a lot of process-based restoration going on through different agencies and NGOs in the hills. And so we're going to be monitoring and researching that. It's still pretty new across the West entirely, but a lot of times when those projects go in, they're not aimed just at fish. People are doing those with the intention of decreasing stream temperature with varying levels of success too. So we'll see if we get some of that in the future.
Other questions?
Is there any resources being devoted to Didimo as far as not spreading it around and stuff?
So, I mean, as far as Didimo, one of the things that, has been in place for quite some time is no felt sole waders. So, that's just a way of, preventing, movement from one stream to the next. With Didimo, it's been here for a number of years now. We've seen Didimo in a few other places other than your typical below Pactola. But we've not seen it proliferate in those locations. I'd say probably about 12 years ago, some of us found some Didimo below Deerfield in the Kinney Canyon walk-in area. And I've not really hardly seen any since. Gene, I think you had some up in, was it Beaver Creek?
Beaver Creek, right above Iron Creek Lake, yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't connect with Iron Creek Lake, but yeah.
So it kind of crops up, in different places at times. I mean, us as an agency, we take a proactive approach. We spray down our waders with a solution so that like when we're working in one watershed and we're moving over to the next watershed, we take some proactive efforts to not spread anything on our own waders. And as far as, it being spread by anglers, it's certainly possible, but I would have thought, we'd probably see that proliferate more at this point. It seems like the rubber sole waders and wading boots are less likely to spread that around than those felt soles. So. And, even just, throughout time, the Didimo below Pactola comes and goes. Some years it's pretty prolific. Other years, not so much. Certainly seems like drought conditions, kind of, you see an increase in those Didimo blooms. But the high water years kind of flush that out. And so it's just kind of, we're living with it, I guess, but I haven't seen it spread much. So I feel like we're in a good place there.
And be rural, we're going to pretty real bad stuff. So.
Yeah. And I mean, Didymo, from a fish perspective, we've not seen big impact directly to the fish. And so, obviously we don't want it to spread. But in the areas, making a direct connection, from Didymo to any decreases in fish abundance or anything like that has been pretty difficult. So. Other questions?
Jeremy, here's one of those off the wall questions. Say you're a walleye snob in a room among trout anglers in Rapid City and you're brand new out here. What would you recommend for someone that is new to the area, coming to the area, just wants to catch some trout, may or may not be able to fly fish? What would your recommendations be for them?
Yeah, so, I guess, going back to, sort of that philosophy of how we manage and, sort of part of that question is we're targeting that type of angler. We want, the people that, they don't know a lot about fishing. They just want to go and catch some fish. We want them to be able to show up at some of our waters, be able to catch fish, and provide that resource to the angler. And so, two things that I tell people is like, I get phone calls from a lot of people that say, hey, I'm coming to Black Hills and I want to go fishing. What do you got for me? And I say, number one, where are you staying? A lot of them are staying right here in Rapid City. So I tell them, hey, if you want to stay close to town, go to Canyon Lake. It's a city park. It's stocked heavily with trout, nice sized trout. It's a great environment for kids to get right out on the water, numerous shore access points. So that's a great place for people to go. The next thing I tell them is, hey, we've got Pactola Reservoir. If you want to get out in the hills, get that, scenic forest environment, head up to Pactola. We stock, some pretty nice sized rainbow trout at our two main boat ramps, the north ramp and the south ramp. We've got shore access in a lot of different areas in those locations. People can get down to the water and fish. So that's what I tell them. If they're a fly fisherman and they say, hey, I want to, get out on the stream and, go to a place where I'm not going to see anybody else, then maybe I tell them, well, if you're willing to drive a little bit, head up to Kinney Canyon below Deerfield. There's a walk-in fishery there. You've got an opportunity to catch brown trout, brook trout, rainbow trout, all in the same stretch of creek. So those are kind of my go-tos, what I suggest to people when they call.
Thanks, Jeremy. Can you all tell I exposed myself there as the walleye guy? So carry on.
I thought it was hypothetical.
Oh yeah, it's very hypothetical.
But that opens up another question, if you would. What's Castle Creek doing below Deerfield?
Yeah, so you guys sampled Castle Creek this year, right?
I don't think we were in Castle Creek this year.
You were in Castle Creek this year?
No.
Okay. So, I did look at a few numbers. I didn't put them in the presentation today. But the numbers that I was looking at was from 2024, right below the bridge. So outside of the walk-in area, downstream of the bridge, on Castle Creek there, the Kinney Canyon walk-in area. So we have a long-term site there. And actually the numbers in that site were higher than average. So I was pleasantly surprised to see, some pretty good trout numbers in that stretch of creek there. The last time I was up there sampling in the catch and release area, saw good numbers of browns and brook trout. The rainbows are usually kind of few and far between in there. But above the reservoir in Castle Creek, up there we've got some wild reproduction of rainbow trout in the creek above Deerfield and Castle Creek and South Fork Castle Creek. Usually see some of those stock rainbows straying up into the stream reaches up in there. So definitely some good opportunities still on.
I do remember now, we were in Castle. We went up there to do the sampling, and most of our historical sites were impacted by beavers. So it was too wide, too deep to get in and use our backpack electric fishing. I mean, it looked great up there. There's a lot of habitat due to those beavers. But we did see a ton of fish up there. If you're familiar with where the culvert is, like, I don't know, maybe 300 meters down from the dam. That's as far up as we went. That site wasn't impacted by beavers at all, and there was a ton of fish in there. And nice fish.
And you were electro fishing?
Yes. Yep.
Nice brook trout?
Yes. Yes, really nice brook trout and brown trout.
Jeremy, since Nick brought up the W word, about the walleye experiment in Sheridan, Stockade, and Deerfield now, right? He puts it in there.
Yeah,
Yeah. There's one nice walleye pulled out of ice at Sheridan.
Yeah, so if you're, a trout lover and a walleye lover, come out next week on Thursday. We're going to be doing another open house to talk about a lot of our walleye fisheries. So yeah, our Black Hills walleye populations. For anybody who isn't aware, we've kind of been about 8 years into this now. Started stocking walleyes. We started with 2 reservoirs, Sheridan and Stockade. So kind of over that time, looking at Sheridan and Stockade, we've just not seen a lot, to be perfectly honest. We have seen a handful of individuals on Stockade. The individuals that we have seen in our nets are usually pretty good size, 18-inch plus. And it certainly seems like the fish that, do survive from our stockings, grow well. That was something that we kind of expected from the get-go, is that, growth in these systems would probably be pretty good. It's just been, we've stocked a number of different products. We've adjusted numbers. To be quite honest, we've kind of thrown the gamut of our walleye playbook at those reservoirs, and we haven't seen any of those plays produce touchdowns yet, if you will. We're kind of looking at it, kind of trying to figure out what that next step is. There's a few things that we'd like to kind of check off the list, if you will. But I'd be lying if I said we were not considering just, ending the stockings on those 2 reservoirs. With that said, Deerfield is, another walleye lake that we most recently, so that's kind of a different reasoning why we stock the walleyes there. Going back to the reason why we initially stocked Sheridan and Stockade, that came from, angler desire, came to Game and Fish, through petitions and then things like that. We just got an overwhelming response from the public saying, hey, we'd like to have some opportunity to fish for walleyes. On Deerfield, we're really looking at that more from the biological aspect and saying, we've got a yellow perch population out there that, the numbers are crazy. I think over the last 3 years, we've taken out about 150,000 yellow perch, and we've yet to see an impact on that population yet. the thought was, we don't have a strong predator presence in that lake from the fish perspective. There are some large lake trout in there, but we're just not seeing a lot of predation on the yellow perch. And so we kind of, we did some public inputs, brought a lot of people together from a lot of different aspects, the walleye anglers, the trout anglers, collected some input on this plan to stock walleyes to impact that yellow perch population. So after collecting that input, we went forward with that plan, started stocking walleyes in there. Would have not been this last fall, but the fall before that. I get my timelines wrong. Let's see. Yeah, it would have been this 2 falls ago. So started stocking walleyes then. This last spring, a year ago in the spring, we stocked some fingerling walleyes. And so at this point, we're still kind of wait and see on those fish, trying to evaluate, turn it over to Chuck here in a second. Chuck has been tasked with evaluating, that, introduction, and kind of looking at the impacts there. So if Chuck, you've got some things on that.
So yeah, like Jeremy mentioned, it's a little bit different situation in your field. At that fairly highly stunted yellow perch population. We didn't see success with those initial stockings, probably because of a timing issue, which created some issues in the mechanics of the food sources in there being able to physically fit in the mouth of the fish we put in there. We do have new opportunities to tweak that coming online. We're putting in some recirculating aquaculture systems in our hatcheries, which are going to make us a little more nimble in how we're able to plan the timing of our stockings. So this year I'm going to figure out how to tweak that timing essentially so that the product we're putting in there, walleye wise, is able to capitalize on those yellow perch the day they hit the water, and that they're hitting the water at the right time when that forage is going to be abundant. So yeah, the pieces are there. We just gotta kind of make them work in unison at this point, and hopefully we'll get the response we're after. Could see an initial, if they do key on to the yellow perch the way we would like them to, an initial boom, and then we're gonna have to find a balance. If the walleye release those yellow perch from their density dependent growth and they're not stunted anymore, we're gonna have to find a balance at that stage. But yeah, it's in the works. It's a different situation, and we're taking the appropriate steps to give ourselves the best chance of success we can.
Yeah, one thing to add to that, so we did have a lake that we had some walleyes in there. It looked like it was going to have a high probability of winter kill. And so we didn't want to lose all those walleyes. We had quite a few walleyes in there, about 15 inches. And so took that opportunity to go in there, take some adult walleyes and move them into Deerfield. So those have been into Deerfield for getting close to a year. And I actually heard from quite a few anglers that caught some of those walleyes this winter through the ice. And so it certainly seems like those 500 fish that we did the transfer on are starting to come on in there. So, and providing a little bit of recreational catch. But certainly, right now, low numbers, but trying to get that plan going, and we'll see how it looks in the future.
Should give about 500 tiger muskies in there.
That was one of the species that we considered, but just not as available to us. through our hatcheries facilities.
Is there any thought about making, like a temporary catch and release in Rapid City, in town, or until the populations improve?
No, and there's been some work done. Actually, Jake kind of took the lead on doing some evaluation of our current catch and release in town. And that catch and release area isn't, it's more of a social regulation than it is a biological one. It doesn't necessarily improve growth or do anything like that. The other thing is, we know that people do harvest some fish in town, but by and large, most people that are fishing Rapid Creek, we've seen this through creel studies over the years. Very few people are actually harvesting fish from the stream. Certainly we, try to provide that harvest opportunity in places like Memorial Pond and Roosevelt Pond, Canyon Lake, and Jackson Pond, some of our community fisheries. So
yesterday I spent quite a bit of time in Canyon Lake Park and watching all these guys fish. They were, catching those fish that are not even, no one was keeping them. They weren't even keeping those 18-inch rainbows. They were all releasing. Didn't see one get, there's a lot of fish being caught, but no one was keeping them. Even when you thought it would take fish, you're still just putting them back. So it's funny. They don't need them. Yeah, I think that's probably right. That's the.
Sorry to backtrack, but I'd like to go back to the next question on what you would tell anglers coming in.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about our online resources with the last 14-day stockings and just and just tell them that what is out there, where they don't have to come and talk to us, they can do it online.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point. So as an agency, we want to make, these things known to the public, and so you can go on our website, on, gfp.sd.gov, and you can access our data. So if you're interested in our stream surveys, you can pull that up. If you're interested in our lake surveys, you can pull up that data. There's a link under the fish tab that says last 14-day stockings. So yeah, that's a great resource just to look and see okay, what's been stocked recently, if I want to get out on some of these waters, high catch rates and, pretty good probability of success. That's a great spot to go and look and, kind of figure out where did these stockings happen. It's not as well known to the public, which is, good thing you brought that up, Blaze. It's good to get that information out to the public anytime that we can. There are ways to see our stocking schedules. Can't see it ahead of time, but yeah, you can see that usually the very next day they're loaded up on there. So
And if I can add on that too, just for y'all in the room, aside from my hard-hitting questions, we are recording this as well. So this is going to be on our YouTube page. We've done similar with Lake Oahe, Lake Sharp. We did Francis Case and Lewis and Clark Lake. So now we're going to have Western South Dakota covered as well. So feel free to share this link with anyone that may ask for it. Really appreciate y'all being here. Really appreciate these guys doing this, because I think that is going to be a really good resource to get this info out there. So this will be on YouTube here in the next couple of days. Please don't hesitate to share it with folks. And then tomorrow night, we're also going to sit down with Jeremy and the other area fisheries supervisors and do kind of our yearly fisheries podcast as well. So my questions, I'm just warming up and seeing kind of how it's received. So I'm ready for tomorrow. So just showing my game plan there, but please feel free to share this.
Horse Leaf Lake and Lakota Lake both had a bunch of work done. How's that working out?
yeah, I mean, I hear a a lot of people say amazing things about Horse Thief. It's a very accessible lake. A lot of the work that created shore fishing access and, improved habitat, things like that. We've seen good results from those projects. I don't hear as much, from Lakota, but, it's, not as on the beaten path, if you will. But yeah, certainly the people that, fish those lakes, I definitely hear from them, and they're saying good things. And, the fisheries in those lakes, mostly is, rainbow trout. We have put some pike into, Lakota over the years. So there's been an opportunity for that in there. Lakota is one of ours that, has some different things, yellow perch, black crappie. We've seen some of that in the years that, Horse Thief as well. It's less of a managed species, if you will, is just, incidental catch or, additional bonus fish, if you will. But yeah, managing those for high catch rates and keep working on the stockings and those. So, thank you.
What about that lake up at Bear View? Does that have trout in it, or is it mostly fish and stuff?
Yeah, so Bear Butte has not got a lot in it right now, unfortunately. So we last winter we had a pretty significant winter kill there. We've had low water conditions in that lake for a number of years now. There is some hope though. So Chris and Grant did a lot of work with the city of Sturgis, BLM, the VA. So there's actually a water treatment plant up on the hill above Sturgis, and from that water treatment plant, water can get diverted one of two directions. It can go kind of over the cliff there right into Bear Butte Creek, or it can be diverted over to Fort Meade Dam and then eventually into Bear Butte Lake. There were some issues with that diversion and the pipe that went under the road, causing some erosion and some leaking and different issues. These guys kind of worked with some different entities to try to address some of those issues and get that flow going again. So we were able to get that flow headed back, getting diverted over to Fort Meade Dam and Bear Butte. So basically from probably April or May last year, we started kind of watching Fort Meade Dam fill up. So we basically got that one filled up now. And that water will probably start making its way to Bear Butte. Now, that water that's being diverted isn't, massive amounts of water. And so it takes it a little while to make it across the landscape and start trickling into Bear Butte. But that water source was, one of the issues that contributed to the low water. So we're hopeful that again we'll get some rains. Maybe that'll help. Get that water pushed along and fill up the lake a little bit. Bear Butte can be a great fishery, when the water levels are good. But I'd say right now, if you could find 3 foot of water in there, you might be lucky. So yeah, it's just, waiting and trying to get that one back online. But, specifically to your question, that's not a water that we manage for trout. Historically, it's been more of a walleye, bass, panfish. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, we'll still be around if you want to come and talk to us directly. If you've got stream questions, Chuck and Gene will be over in that corner there. Grant and Chris will be over here if you want to talk to them about habitat projects or anything. And then if you've got general questions or questions about reservoirs, you can come see me and Blaze over in this corner here. So with that, appreciate you all coming out, and yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Well, don't be discouraged by the turnout tonight. It's just kind of the way things go, but I'm sure all of us here and many more out there really appreciate the work you guys are doing.
Yeah, you know, we were talking about it right before the meeting, and said that you know, it's a beautiful evening out there. Beautiful evenings tend to have lower turnout. So a lot of reasons to be out fishing tonight. So yeah, we're not discouraged, but we appreciate you all showing up.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.